for Justice here at NYU School of Law, and we are thrilled to have you here for this important, challenging, and I expect perhaps moving conversation about the great and ongoing fight to live up to our nation's highest ideals. We are delighted to be part of this series, first of all, this citywide festival sponsored by Carnegie Hall that has pulled in wonderful organizations and institutions from across the city, from the Schomburg Center to the New York Public Library to the New York Historical Society, to examine the decade of the 1960s and move beyond the sort of music video treatment that we sometimes give it, the nostalgia to which many of us are prone, but to really look at the way in which the epochal events of that decade changed the country and continue to change the country and continue to be at the heart of the fights that divide the country. We here at the Brennan Center are honored to be part of those fights. For those of you who do not know us, we are a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works, as we see it, to reform and revitalize, and when necessary, defend the institutions and the systems of democracy and justice in America. This is a moment when that defense is vitally needed, we believe. We work with our colleagues at NYU School of Law. We're affiliated with NYU. We work with so many of you in the legal and civic community here in New York. We work on issues ranging from money in politics to criminal justice reform to the eternal and critical fight to vote, the fight for voting rights. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We shall overcome. The most indelible image in some ways from that decade is that line of marchers in black and white very often from Selma to Montgomery, singing that mournful and proud and defiant hymn, calling the country to live up to what it claims to believe in. We Shall Overcome was, as you may know, a remarkable moment in a speech delivered to propose the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson in March of 1965, just a week after the events at the bridge in Selma, just a week after Bloody Sunday. That is not merely something from the past. We want to understand what happened back then, the significance, the magnitude of what happened back then, but also the incredible struggle it took to get real change and a real meaningful right to vote for all Americans for the first time in the country's history. But as we all know all too well, the fight over the right to vote is a very current fight. The title of this event is Voting Rights Then and Now. And right now, every day, in courtrooms and legislative halls and TV studios across the country, that right to vote is under assault in a way it has not been under assault in decades. We've seen a wave of laws across the country to make it harder to vote for the first time since the Jim Crow era. So this is not only important to understand the past, it's important to understand the present. And we are just extraordinarily honored to be here with all of you to be part of this conversation. Let me introduce our panelists. First of all, to my immediate left is Bill Moyers.
Very much to his left.
But from their perspective, it's to the right. So, you know, this is a topsy-turvy time. Bill Moyers, as no doubt you know, is one of the country's legendary television journalists for 4 decades. He has, among other things, received 30, and that is not a typo, 30 Emmy Awards for his journalism, his commentary, his documentaries. He's been the producer and host of shows ranging from The Power of Myth to now with Bill Moyers, the author of numerous books among others, and of great relevance, Moyers on democracy. And he began his career, his national career certainly, growing up in Marshall, Texas, and after becoming a Baptist minister, working for, I did get that right, didn't I? It's a good credential to have, even if it's not true, but if it is true, it's even better. Working as special assistant to President Lyndon Johnson and as his press secretary. And as reported in the media at the time, in many ways his top aide during the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The New York Times Magazine, in a profile of Bill Moyers, said he was the #2 Texan in the White House at the time, and has an extraordinary perspective, both as somebody who saw how the levers of power were wielded, who wielded them himself, and who then went on to be one of the most profound moral voices for democracy that our country has. We are honored to have you here. And to his left or right, from depending on the perspective you take, is our friend and colleague, Kristen Clarke. Kristen is the president and CEO of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. That is the organization founded by the summons of President John F. Kennedy at the time of the Civil Rights Movement to enlist the legal community all across the country on behalf of civil rights and voting rights. Kristen worked as an attorney at the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division herself, with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and as director of the Bureau of Civil Rights for the New York State Attorney General before taking on this job. She is one of the great leaders and voices for civil rights in this country, and a great colleague and partner to us in so many of our efforts, and we're delighted to have you here as well. And across the stage, put it that way, is my friend and our colleague, Myrna Pérez, who is Deputy Director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice and leads our team on voting rights and elections. She is one of the leading election law experts in the country. She teaches at Columbia and NYU, is the lead litigator, among others, for us in the fight against the Texas voter ID case and in numerous other courtrooms across the country, and among other things has co-chaired the Election Law Committee of the New York City Bar, and brings tremendous passion to this fight as well. And so thinking about the past and understanding the present and future, I would like to start with what you experienced and what you were part of.
Well, first let me say how grateful I am to be here at one of my spiritual homes, the Brennan Center. The small foundation that I was running at the time was a modest contributor to the initial effort to get this organization up and running, and I've seen it flower in ways that make me think that was one of the finest grants we ever made. You and our two colleagues here on the panel are both warriors in the frontline fight for civil rights and human rights, and it's just a pleasure to be among so many kindred spirits. You know, the moral force of human rights sometimes meets a responsive political power. And the combination and the combustion of those two forces create a transformation in history. I was privileged to be present at two of those moments of transcendence and transformation in my lifetime. One was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when I was in the White House as the orchestrator and conductor for a time of Lyndon Johnson's domestic policy. The other was 9 months to 10 months later when we passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They are intimately and inseparable. One would not have happened without the other. A footnote is that after the I'm known for just a couple of things that I said in that period of time. One was, or I heard, one was after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, I flew to Texas with the president. He went down to recreate himself. And after we got to the ranch around midnight at 12:30, I went over to his bedroom to just to say what a great day it had been. And he had brought from the Jetstar we flew down on the Bulldog edition of the Washington Post, which said President signs historic bill. And yet he seemed down. And I said, Mr. President, you should really be jubilant tonight. I mean, look at what happened today. And he said, yes, but I'm afraid we just handed the South to the Republican Party for the remainder of my life and yours. That was prescient, because he knew that the segregationists who had constituted the core of the Democratic Party would now leave and go to the nearest home, which was the Republican Party, and that proved to be a valid, prescient insight. After he passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, I asked him, do you think this means the first black president in our lifetime? And he said, oh no, oh my God, no, there's too much bigotry, there's too much hatred, there's too much history. And I'll come back to that in a moment. There's too much history. He said, we'll have a woman president before we have a black president. And on the night that Barack Obama was elected in 2008, I said to Judith, my wife, you hear that thumping on the ceiling above us? And she said, no, I don't. And I said, well, I do, and it's Lyndon Johnson saying I was half right and half wrong. They were historic moments, both of those two. And I have to say, history is a witness to our times, no matter the time we live in. And in the 64 and 65 campaigns for human, civil, and voting rights, we were very conscious of then and now. The long then, the struggle from the end of the first third of the American experience, up until then, up until the Civil War, only white males could vote. There was a growing sentiment for the women's suffrage. I found the other day a note in a letter in one of my files, a note in a letter from Abraham Lincoln written in 1936. I go, Lincoln wrote, for all sharing the privileges of the government who assist in bearing its burdens. Consequently, I go for admitting all whites to the right of suffrage who pay taxes or bear arms, and by no means excluding females. That was 1936. No mention of black people. The Civil War happened, and there was a period of time when it looked we might have torn the whitewash, literally and metaphorically, off the American experience. The Congress made it possible for the Confederate states to come back into the Union, provided they offered suffrage to the freed blacks. Then they passed the 1970, what was that, the 15th Amendment in 1970?
In
1870, right? That enlarged the franchise it brought blacks into the franchise. And then the Military Construction Act tried to nail that down. After which, of course, you know what happens. The Hayes-Tilden compromise, pull the federal troops out of the South, and the white supremacists returned with a vengeance, a real violent vengeance. And that prevailed with the new Jim Crow law and morality up until the 1960s. I grew up in a small town in East Texas that lived under the Jim Crow law. 20,000 people, 10,000 blacks, 10,000 whites, and the twain didn't mix except when the black women worked for a quarter of an hour to do the laundry for white women, including my mother. You could grow up in that little town, well-loved, well-churched, and well-taught, and be totally unaware of the lived experience of half of the population just away down the street. That's how strict and how powerful and how conformist the Jim Crow laws were. I never saw a black person vote. I never saw a black person in politics. They knew better than to cross the invisible line, the Jim Crow line. And that prevailed up until the 60s. And then history became now, not then. Because thanks to the sacrifice and courage and commitment of so many, to this day, unidentified young black men and women in the South, thanks to the martyrdom of thousands, thanks to the blood that spilled from courageous acts of challenging Jim Crow, the times begin to change. And then thanks to, and I don't use that, I don't mean thanks, I mean because of the changing, because of what happened with an assassination. A president Lyndon Johnson was thrust into the White House at a time when nobody thought a Southern president should be there. No one thought Lyndon Johnson would ever champion civil rights. When he was elected to Congress in 1937, his first vote was cast to protect lynching. He fought every civil rights act through his career in Congress up until 1957, when as majority leader of the Senate, he helped to pass the first civil rights bill since the Civil War, and it was a bill that he so effectively brokered the negotiations that it was a bill largely without teeth. The same thing happened in 1960. He did support the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Education, and he refused to sign the Southern Manifesto that a number of all Southern senators signed after the Brown versus Board of Education. But he was no champion of civil rights. He opposed Harry Truman's civil rights program in the 1948, and there are many of us who believe that Harry Truman became president because he so thoroughly embraced civil rights, and on the last day of the election had a rally up in Harlem of 10,000 African Americans that demonstrated the power of the new vote in the North that was coming from black precincts. But Johnson never took a commanding stand. He was always on the other side of the issue. I don't think he actually changed as much as circumstances and constituencies changed, because he was never a racist in what I understood to be his spirit, his soul. He was a practical racist by using politics, by using race to advance his career when he was a young man. But as history caught up, he changed, and not so much in terms of his belief about equality, because as a young man he taught in a school of Hispanic kids down in Texas, and those kids all said later when they were interviewed by oral biographers that he was a large and generous man and always kind and helpful to them and accepting of them. But then in 1964, he realized that, as I said earlier, history had caught up with him. The Civil Rights Act was a very almost impossible one to pass. It was the first act to outlaw segregation in public facilities. It had a voting rights provision in it, the 64 Act did, and Congress, not with the White House's complicity, but Congress took that out, and that angered Johnson. He saw 1964 as a moment for the first historic breakthrough. The Kennedy Civil Rights Bill had been paralyzed. He had come in. There was a feeling of national grief, which made a desire for some kind of redemption to happen, and Johnson exploited that to move a number of pieces of stall legislation, but primarily the Civil Rights Act forward, and he saw this was the opportunity. I've never seen a man or anyone work longer and harder, be on the phone, be more strategic, more tactical, more potent than I saw Lyndon Johnson. Remember, he was in public life about 40 years. I only served 4 years with him, so I don't know the whole story of Lyndon Johnson. But in these 12 months in 64 and 6 more in 50, in 70, in 65, I never saw a more intense commitment to get something done. We followed the news every day. He would call me in the morning when I was still working with domestic policy, which continued. Did my mic go out? I continued to work on domestic policy through right up till the time of the passage of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act, and then he, against my will, I became press secretary. But he would call me early in the morning. What's the news from Alabama? What's the news from Mississippi? What's the news from Arkansas? What's going on with so-and-so and so-and-so? Here we go. Here, can you hear me now? Yeah. Oh, good. And he was intensely engaged in, he knew, because I remember him talking about it, that in Selma, Alabama, there were in 1964 and 65, there were 115,000 registered white voters, give or take a few, and 114,000 black registered voters, give or take a few. Of the black voters, 114,000, 1%, or 156 of them were registered. He could quote that statistic after the marches in Selma made Selma inevitable, day in and day out. And he agreed with Martin Luther King that there need to be a march. In fact, in December of 64, LBJ suggested that Martin Luther King, he was already doing it, but Johnson not only endorsed it, but encouraged, find a place where he could stage demonstrations so that a white man on a tractor somewhere in a black soil field in Alabama or Mississippi would be moved by what he saw. It's not a direct quote, but it's a succinct summary of it. And Martin Luther King kept his eye on that moment and that place and came up with the idea of a march in Selma because of the Voting Rights Act. And that led to the confrontation that led to the great speech that you referred to a moment ago.
Even so, it was not an easy moment to have that pressure brought down, I would imagine, on President Johnson, even though he understood the usefulness of it as well. Reading the transcripts of the tapes or hearing the tapes that he made or reading stories, there was both an understanding of the power of the images from Selma, but also the upheaval it was causing in the country. What was it like during that period in the run-up to Bloody Sunday and then the days afterwards?
Well, there was LBJ, we had just passed the Civil Rights Act 9 months earlier. He thought Congress was exhausted. We were exhausted. It was night and day. And he felt that we, the Justice Department, the White House, and the Congress were not up to another major brawl over civil rights, quite frankly. Martin Luther King and his lieutenants kept pressing, as they should have, but the backlash began at that time with a force unlike probably anything since the backlash to Reconstruction 70, 80 years earlier. And so Johnson was getting calls from friends and allies, including liberals around the country, saying, this is no time for another fight. We'll have an uprising around the country among whites that we will regret. So just settle back, let things settle down, and then let's go after voting rights. He finally decided he couldn't wait. He decided, to the contrary of what he felt and had been said, that the moment had come to strike because the civil rights movement had gained such momentum. But it was a tense moment. Presidents stand at the center of centrifugal forces coming from many directions, and this was one where it was intense.
And I've read, well, we'll find out if this works somehow. I've read that you were sent out, among other things, to try to talk to the demonstrators in the White House who were sitting in.
No, there were 7 young men, young African Americans, who entered the visitors gallery on the east side of the White House and sat down. They were very peaceful, they were very well dressed, they were very thoughtful, and they were very, very sincere. And the president said, go over and talk to them, which I did. We had a wonderful discussion, and they explained why they were there. We said, for the moment, just stay as long as you want to. they finally left. They were very peaceful.
And so,
The real tension came with Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King got impatient with the president. And the president asked him to come to the White House. He didn't want to come. Martin Luther King did not want to come because he knew how powerfully seductive Lyndon Johnson was. Then there was another time Lyndon Johnson didn't want King to come, and he wanted to come. It went back and forth like that.
and then George Wallace did come because he needed to get out of the jam, and was so overwhelmed by President Johnson's advocacy, he went out and told reporters if he'd stayed in much longer, he would have come out for civil rights, as I understand it.
That's a scene I wish I could actually describe for you. George Wallace was caught between his own powerful forces. He wanted the president to call up to federalize the National Guard. That would enable him to say, look, the son of a bitch has taken over our state. We can't, and Johnson would have become the real enemy. Johnson did not want to federalize the National Guard for that reason. He wanted Wallace to take responsibility for calling up the National Guard to protect the marchers. And so you had Alabama guards defending Martin Luther King's marchers. So they went back and forth, and finally Wallace came for 3 hours. I cannot describe. Wallace went on to say, once you give these people the right to vote, they'll want the right to marry, they'll want the right to do this, they'll want the right to do that. Yeah. You just can't do it. And he said, I can't call up the Alabama Guard, I don't have the money. At which point, LBJ got up out of his rocking chair. Wallace was sitting on a couch. He was a small man. Johnson was a tall, big, powerful, built man. And Johnson leaned over, put both arms on Wallace's shoulders like this, leaned over to his face. George, you're fucking with the president. Why are you fucking with your president? No, that's a direct quote. Why are you fucking with your president? And Wallace just seemed to shrink. He just seemed to disappear like, what was that movie recently, Downsized? George Wallace was downsized right in front of our eyes there. And so when Wallace wobbled out, he had really been diminished as a force. And you caught him on the camera, as you said.
And there was an extraordinary movement going on around the country almost spontaneously all around this time, both in Selma, where people were flooding in, and then in cities all over the country, tens of thousands of people demonstrating, speaking out for change. And finally, on the weekend, the congressional leadership came to the White House. And as I understand it, the president, again, knowing of what was going on the outside and using it, managed to get himself invited to go give this speech to propose the Voting Rights Act.
Exactly.
And what was that like? And I do want to ask, as the former speechwriter, I have a very particular question, which was that remarkable line, "We shall overcome." Was that Dick Goodwin, the speechwriter who worked on it? Was that President Johnson? Was that perhaps you? Or
No, Dick Goodwin wrote the speech. I'll come back to that in a moment. Of course, we're shorthanding a whole lot here, neglecting a lot, but it was Martin Luther King and his movement that brought about the real change, because King, in January of '65, began a series of demonstrations in Selma, because, again, it was really strictly segregated. Everything in Selma was segregated, including the ballot box, as I said earlier. And King and the SLCL moved forward on a series of demonstrations, marches. They wanted to march from Selma to the Montgomery, the state capital, 80 miles down Highway 80. And there was Sheriff Jim Clark, who was in control of Dallas County, Alabama. He's the man who carried the gun and the cattle prod to use against demonstrators. In an earlier demonstration, he had shoved a woman named, I think, Mrs. Carrie Moore, and she had returned force with force. She had hit him in the face, not once but twice, knocked him down. He got up, knocked her down, stood on top of her with his cattle prod waving like this. That picture was on the front page of the New York Times the next day, and that was a decisive moment when you had this bully of a man standing on top of an African-American woman with his cattle prod and his pistol on his hip in clear fashion. But there was one thing after another. I mean, there was a young civil rights activist, Jimmy Lee Johnson, who was murdered. There was violence. I can't describe the violence to you against women and young people and men. And when the marchers got to Pérez Bridge, as you've seen in all the movies, in all the documentaries, Jim Clark and George Wallace sent the troopers forward on their horses. They rode down the demonstrators. They dismounted, started beating the demonstrators with their sticks and stomping on them. You can actually see that. Well, that reviled the nation, and ABC happened to be there with its cameras rolling. And Sunday night, March 8th, I guess it was, or 6th, March 7th, on Sunday night, they interrupted a showing of Judgment at Nuremberg with a long report from Selma, which we watched at the White House, which the nation watched, and there was a revulsion. The moral courage of those demonstrators in Selma was astonishing, a moment of history. So on the next day, the Monday, Martin Luther King made an appeal for volunteers to come from all over the country, and hundreds came. You know, knowing that James Reeb, a Universalist minister from Boston, had also been murdered, killed down there, and they marched to the. As I said, the second march took place. They marched to the edge of Pérez Bridge, knelt down. King prayed. They got up and went back. One reason he went back is that we had negotiated an agreement with him that if he'd give us time, the Justice Department would work out with Judge Frank Johnson, a judge a federal judge there, a permission for the march to continue, making then, if the demonstrators continued, the resistance from the Alabama troops illegal. And I actually had the last call, except maybe Nick Katzenbach, the deputy acting attorney general, but Martin Luther King called me early in the morning that morning to just make sure that the agreement was in effect. He was really scared for his life. He had, right there on the front lines, knowing that it was Clark and Governor Wallace's henchman, who was the state security officer, who was a vicious man, and he was an amateur anthropologist who believed that blacks were descended from the Igbo tribe in Nigeria, and they weren't our kind of blacks, he would say, because they didn't have Arab blood. You explained it, but he was a vicious man, and he gave the signal for what happened. That reverberated. That said to Johnson, after the congressional delegations come, I'll make the speech next week, and that turned the tide. When we finished this, I brought a few excerpts from that speech I'd like to share with you. It was a remarkable moment in American history.
Well, thank you. And let's, in the coming weeks, there was the drive necessary to pass the Voting Rights Act, for the first time to bring the full power of the federal government down on the states to create the opportunity to vote for African Americans and for others as well. Among the most effective provisions was Section 5, which required states with a history of discrimination to get pre-approval from the Justice Department in advance, or a federal court in Washington in advance, before changing their voting practices. And for the next half century, and now I'm going to bring in our colleagues, that became one of the most effective pieces of legislation in American history. We always hear about the law of unintended consequences, which is always used as an explanation of why no one should ever do anything. Sometimes it's the law of intended consequences, and that was an extraordinarily successful law. And I would like to actually bring in Kristen Clarke. You worked in the Justice Department, in the Civil Rights Division. Tell us about what that involved, and tell us about the Shelby County case in 2013, half a century after President Kennedy's assassination, and what that did.
Sure. So let me first say that I consider myself a student of voting rights history and a student of the Voting Rights Act, but that was just breathtaking, Bill. That journey, so thank you for sharing and adding layers to the history that I think was probably eye-opening for many of us in this room. And thank you for your work and your service to our country. For many of us who do this work, the Voting Rights Act, I think, is the most important and remarkable piece of federal civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress. And what's remarkable is that it came about in the 60s, and that I don't think today you could see a law like this emerge from our Congress, which is just so broken and deeply polarized and blind to so much of the discrimination that remains rampant today. Over the next 5 decades in which the Voting Rights Act was fully in place, it did incredible and important work to fight back and push back against a lot of the voting discrimination that remained rampant in many parts of the country. The Section 5 preclearance provision that Michael mentioned was the heart of the Voting Rights Act. This is a part of the law that applied to states like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, states that had the longest and most egregious histories of voting discrimination. And it required essentially that before they could put in place a new law impacting voting, they had to get federal review of that voting change to make sure it wasn't one that worsened the position of African American voters and other minority voters in those states. And it blocked literally hundreds of laws that would have turned the clock back when it came to advancing progress. So discriminatory redistricting plans, efforts to cancel elections, and other barriers that officials were endeavoring to put in place throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s were ones blocked by this preclearance provision. And it not only blocked laws, but it also deterred many officials from trying to move forward with discriminatory measures. One quick little powerful example of how Section 5 worked comes out of Kilmichael, Mississippi. I find that it's helpful to sometimes animate how this law worked. Kilmichael, Mississippi, rural place. Many of you probably have never heard of it. Show of hands. A place off the beaten path. A new census had come out that showed that African Americans had just become a numerical majority in this small little town, which had been governed by a white mayor and 5 all-white council members throughout the town's history. A number of African Americans decided to run for office, so they put their names in and qualified to run for a council seat, and the officials decided to cancel the election. But because that was an action that impacted voting, they had to submit it for federal review, and I was at the Justice Department at that time, and we blocked Kilmichael officials from canceling the election. The election went forward, and for the first time in this town's history, they elected the first African American mayor and elected a number of African Americans to a majority of those seats. That outcome would not have been possible but for the strong medicine provided by the preclearance provision of the act. But people have had their eyes set on tearing down and gutting the act throughout the decades. The law is not permanent, and Congress had to periodically go back to the drawing board to determine whether or not the law remained necessary. And the last time they did that was in 2006. Congress held a number of hearings, and they heard testimony and heard from witnesses all across the country. And at the end of that process, it became very clear that discrimination remained rampant in those 16 states and that we still needed Section 5. It passed in the Senate by a vote of 98-0. But days before the ink was dry on the bill, there were a number of folks who filed constitutional challenges to the law. The first one came out of Texas and ultimately was not successful in gutting the act, but remarkably, the case that really did gut the act came out of Alabama, right? So Alabama is both the birthplace of the Voting Rights Act and the state that put the death knell in the law. So Shelby County, Alabama, files a case arguing that the law is unconstitutional, it's no longer necessary, discrimination is a thing of the past. And Justice Roberts issued a ruling 5 years ago that said that this part of the Voting Rights Act that identified those 16 states was unconstitutional. And it brought Section 5 to a grinding halt and essentially put the ball in Congress's court to come up with a new formula that would allow the country to move forward with this Section 5 preclearance provision. And 5 years have passed and we're still waiting. There's been no action. We are still waiting for Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act.
So let me just say, first of all, for those who are listening at home, this is the Brennan Center for Justice, Voting Rights Then and Now. And thank you, Kristen. And
Yeah, do you know, I'm sure you do know, I discovered it while working to prepare a documentary on, I discovered while preparing to work on a documentary, I never did, that in 1981, a young lawyer at the Justice Department named John Roberts was assigned the task of seeing what could be done to reverse the Voting Rights Act of 1965 through that enormous octopus-like apparatus that is at the heart, if they have a heart, of the Republican Party. They finally got John Roberts on the court so that he could act on, and I'm sure you've seen, I've read many of the memos, the documents that he worked on at the Justice Department. It's astonishing how strategic their conspiracy is.
And how determined he was.
And determined he was.
And at the argument in Shelby County, Justice Scalia drew gasps when he said, well, the Voting Rights Act, that's a great name. It's nothing more, he said, than a racial entitlement. And people gasped just like that. But John Roberts wrote the opinion, and he was a lot more measured. And he said, in effect, well, that was then and this is now, and it is no longer needed. Myrna, Pérez, what has happened since Shelby County came down, and what is left of the Voting Rights Act, and what is the fight to give it as much life as possible?
Well, what has happened is a wave of restrictions has passed across the country trying to make it harder for people to register and vote. The Brennan Center is one of a number of groups that have been fighting back on that. We've been successful, but it has been an enormous drain on resources. And I think a really good example is my own home state of Texas. So you guys have probably heard that Texas passed the strictest photo ID law in the country. It was famously known for making it possible for you to vote if you carried your concealed gun license, but not if you had your University of Texas student ID. This was the classic example of the kind of case that preclearance would have dealt with. In fact, preclearance was in the process of dealing with this matter before the Voting Rights Act was gutted. So we are now left litigating under another provision of the Voting Rights Act. It's called Section 2. It applies nationwide, it doesn't have a time limit, and basically what it deals with is a practice or a standard that denies or abridges the right to vote. So that's good on paper, but there are a number of difficulties in litigating under Section 2. The first is the tremendous amount of time that it took. The pre-clearance process usually was over and done with in about 60 days. You would get a ruling from the Department of Justice. Generally, that would be enough. And as my friend Kristen pointed out, the deterrence effect alone settled most of them. A lot of people didn't even bother. I can tell everybody that the first time I won the Texas photo ID case, I was on maternity leave, and my kid is about to graduate from kindergarten. We are still fighting that case. And that brings me to the second issue, is that it does nothing to deter gamesmanship. So we have won this case numerous times, including before the very conservative Fifth Circuit. That court determined that it would have the effect of making it, of this law making it harder for minorities to vote. What did Texas do? It went and passed a strict photo ID light version. It was not quite as egregious as the bill that it passed. The parts that the Fifth Circuit specifically said were a problem, it tinkered around the edges. But they're trying to say now that they have a whole new photo ID law and we have to start all over again. Now, granted, we're contesting this. We're fighting this. This is something that we are arguing in the Fifth Circuit, and we're hoping to get a ruling on this pretty soon. But this would not have happened had we had Section 5. It would have been dealt with in a much more expeditious manner. The other thing is who has the burden of proof? For those folks that are lawyers in the room, or law students, I hope there's a bunch of you guys here, who has the burden of making the case can have a big impact on who wins and who loses. And under Section 5, the jurisdiction had the burden of showing that it would not make minority voters worse off, that whatever change or tinkering they were doing was left to the jurisdiction to show that it was going to not have an impact. In this case, the plaintiffs have to prove, in my case, the Texas NAACP and Malk and Kristen's organization is co-counsel with us, we're in the position of having to prove that that this law is going to have a discriminatory effect or was passed with discriminatory intent. And that's pretty hard to do now because people are pretty smart about what they write in emails now or what they say on the floor. And that shift in the burden of proof is going to make it much more difficult for us to make the case. Now, I don't want any of you to be discouraged because I will tell you there are some of the best lawyers in the business working to protect your voting rights out there. But it still means that we need to be vigilant. It means we need to garner more resources, and it means that we need to have a long-term approach for how we build up the jurisprudence around Section 2, because so much of the voting rights cases happened under Section 5. One of the things that is so important about this Texas photo ID case that we're litigating is that it's likely going to go to the Supreme Court, and it's going to be one of the first cases with a really big record as to what Section 2 means now. How much teeth does it have? How successful, how strong, how powerful of a protection is it going to be in protecting persons' right to vote? And that is going to not be settled with just one case, it's going to be settled with a whole body of cases. So we need to be bringing forward the lawsuits, only the good ones for all of you guys that are out there trying to challenge everything. We need to bring in the smartest, strongest, most strategic cases we can to make sure that Section 2 jurisprudence is able to provide the kind of protections that our voters need today.
And this, of course, is a fight that is being waged not only in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion.
Yeah.
And not only in the Deep South, but in many ways across the country. Whereas for so long, the Justice Department, sometimes with gusto, sometimes timidly, but generally was on the right side. Right now, we're in a situation where the Justice Department has switched sides, both in these specific cases, but more broadly, as you know, last year, President Trump said that he really won the popular vote when you, quote, subtract the millions of illegal voters who cast their ballots, he said. And I always point out they must be special, not only illegal voters, but invisible illegal voters, since nobody saw them. Not Fox News, not the police, not any of the lawyers who were there. But he launched, to justify his tweets, in effect, he launched a national investigative commission to try to prove the existence of widespread voter fraud in America. And it is a good thing to say that thanks to lawsuits brought by our organizations and a lot of activism and basically a combination of litigation and ridicule, that commission—
And incompetence.
And incompetence on their part, that commission imploded. But the fight continues, and I would like to ask a broader question for all three of you. As you think about the country today, what is different today and what is the same, perhaps, from 50 years ago? How much of a point does John Roberts have that things have changed? I really, any one of you who wants to start thinking about that.
So what's different and what's it, so let me answer that a slightly different way. As you were talking just now, Michael, I think one important point to note is that this Election Integrity Commission that was launched by President Trump is unbelievable To me, it shocks the conscience that in 2018, we'd have a White House that is so focused and bent on launching an effort that's end goal was to lay the groundwork to promote voter suppression laws across the country. That was the true end goal of the commission. It was not just to substantiate his false and baseless claims that 2.8 million people voted unlawfully in 2016. He wanted to promote restrictive, burdensome, discriminatory photo ID laws like the one we're fighting in Texas as Myrna's child has grown up. He wanted to promote proof of citizenship requirements, and this is an issue that's on trial this week in Kansas. Trump appointed a whole slate of characters to run this commission that's now been disbanded, people who've dedicated their professional careers to promoting voter suppression. To lead the commission, he appointed Secretary of State Chris Kobach. His claim to fame is he's all about promoting voter suppression, and one measure that he has been backing is a requirement that when you register to vote, you provide a copy of a birth certificate or a copy of your passport if you want that voter registration form processed. And this literally has blocked and denied thousands of people the ability to get onto the registration rolls in Kansas. That's on trial right now. I think about the days that you described when you were doing this work, and what shocks me is we have people who still harbor such hostility in their heart today. We still have people who fear the growing diversity across our country and are so determined to erect any barrier to prevent African Americans, Latinos, and other minority communities from having a voice in our democracy. To me, we've made progress, but we still have so much work to do.
What would you say?
I would say one real big difference is the way that the country has changed in terms of who are quote unquote minority populations. So much of the 60s struggle was what I was taught to call like a black-white paradigm. Right, and right now, Latinos are the second biggest minority group. Asians are the fastest growing minority group. We still have politicians, I think, that think of the world in a black-white paradigm. We still have civil rights groups, and we still have foundations, and we still have news media that still think of the world in a black-white paradigm, and folks that look like me and folks that look like other minority groups are not as part of the consciousness in terms of what our struggles and what our laws need to look like. I want to be really clear. The law in Texas was not passed because people were worried about the growing African American community, because it was not growing. It was just a little bit numbers above the way its standard been growing for like the last few years. It's because the Latino population has increasingly grown, and because Latinos are being more split in terms of how they vote. They're not voting as reliably for the Republican Party. And as long as we have this multifaceted experience among people of color, we need to make sure that we have laws and policies that reflect that, and that means we need to share power, and we need to understand that the country is getting a little bit more complicated, and that when we are talking about solutions and when we're talking about threats, that we look a bit more broadly than what I think we as a country have historically been trained to do when we think about civil rights issues.
Bill, as you think about this.
I'm going to take that. What's changed is that we are experiencing now a resurgence of another historic force in the American story, and it is the backlash of the privileged people, in this case, the white race, that has always met every revolutionary change with a reaction. I mean, the Civil War was not fought for nothing. The Civil War was fought to free the slave. But it took 100 years between Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation and Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. By the way, he once called me up on the phone and said, that other Johnson, he vetoed a civil rights bill, didn't he? I didn't know what he was talking about. I looked it up. Yes, Andrew Johnson vetoed a bill, the Civil Rights Bill of 1966, which established citizenship for anybody born in this country, irrespective of race or conditions of servitude, race, color, and previous servitude. And the Congress passed it, did the right thing. Andrew Johnson vetoed it, and then that began an enormous backlash against the breakthrough that came at Appomattox. And it lasted, in effect, for 100 years, as I said earlier. Then you had that was the backlash to the Reconstruction. You had our administration, Kennedy's administration, the good things that FDR finally did, and you had a progressive period met by a backlash with George Wallace and Richard Nixon. Read the Nixon tapes with Haldeman, where they're saying we can keep this thing going if we take on the blacks, take them on and screw up their neighborhoods, give them a bad press and all. There was a backlash.
The war on drugs, and that'll keep
and then the war on drugs was in fact instituted for that purpose. It's on the record. This is not a journalist delusion. Then you had Barack Obama, and there's a backlash to that. There's another deconstruction going on after the Reconstruction, embodied in the first black president, as Lyndon Johnson said would come later, but not immediately. We're in a time of a historic resurrection of the backlash embodied in the people resistant to the idea that all men and women are created equal, that America's piety toward equality was a truth that needed to be fulfilled. And we have to, they're organized in a party. Remember, the Republican and the Democratic parties were the creation in the latter part of the 19th century when the courts allowed private parties to determine how people voted. The white primary in the state of Texas was invented by private parties. They took it out of the political realm. They took it out of the moral realm inscribed in the Declaration of Independence and gave the Republican Party today is a private club. So is the Democratic Party. I'm not trying to make a distinction there, but they're well organized. They've attracted the people fearful of that, the backlash people, and they've got huge sums of money, which they did not have in the 1960s. Money, Citizens United was not a force. Money was always a force in politics, but it did not influence legislation. I'm sorry to do it this way. The great Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt said, "Beware the terrible simplifiers," and I've been simplifying a lot tonight, and I regret it. But we're in a period now it's not new. It's just larger, more venomous, more determined, more tenacious, and it has the power of government that we used for human rights turned against human rights. And if you don't believe elections matter, look back to 2016.
Well, and this is as we were discussing backstage, we often discuss ourselves at the Brennan Center. Is this new, or is this really the same old story? And in a sense, as you've just said, it's an ongoing story, but what is new is to have the power, the brute force of the federal government behind the most retrograde elements of this debate.
Exactly right.
George Wallace ran, but he came in third, and he didn't hold the White House. I want to ask you one more question, then we will open this up to the many questions I know folks have. One of the things that does seem perhaps different now compared to then is the potential role, for good or ill, of the media. Dr. King and the other activists of the time very consciously were playing to the cameras. In other words, they knew that if they could provoke a confrontation, that it would pull in the attention of the world.
That's right.
And there was such a thing as a news media that people of both parties and all political stripes, more or less, trusted and paid attention to. And of course, in a lot of, at least that's how it has been retailed to us over the years. Now, of course, it seems like a much more polarized environment and harder to imagine that happening. Is that a simplification of what it was like back then? And what kind of role can the media play today?
Television was new in those days, and I do not believe we'd have made change come as fast as we did if television had not shown Americans who were entranced by it, the dogs and the fire hoses and the truncheons that were turned on the demonstrators in Birmingham, in the Birmingham jail, in Birmingham. I do not believe that without the coverage of Bloody Sunday in March of '65, we would have had the Voting Rights Act as soon as we did, if at all. There's no question, but that the mediating influence of a non-ideological media at that time was a powerful tool that could be used to advance our society. Then we came to, a partisan media. I have often thought that if I did my last documentary, it ought to be titled "The Evil Men Do Lives On," because if you look at Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and the right-wing media that has given voice to the historic backlash, the historic prejudices and bigotries that are latent in the human heart, has given them force, allied them with a party, the Republican Party, you have something you did not have in the 1960s. But there's one other thing that's changed because of the media and other ingredients. There is the power of the human voice, which is so fragmented today and so inhibited by the commercial principles of corporate media, which corporate media looks at you as consumers to sell you something, not as citizens capable of acting democratically. And as a result, we've lost the power of rhetoric. Does not resonate as it used to. And if I can, my colleague Karen Kimball over here and I did a lot of research for this, and I regret that because I don't have the chance to tell you everything I'd like to tell you. But we researched.
We're eager to hear it.
We researched Johnson's speech. We researched Johnson's speech back in '65, and I went through all my own notes from that time. I didn't write the speech. Dick Goodwin, a remarkable writer who had been in the Kennedy White House, and we brought back, wrote it, and a number of us around Johnson Circle, Jack Valenti, Horace Busby, myself, we did edits. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson contributed to it, and we had that speech. We only had 24 hours to do it because he decided on the 14th to make it. There were all-day meetings. Dick Goodwin was called in, got to the office at 9 o'clock on the day the speech was to be delivered, and started writing and had it finished in mid-afternoon. But I happened to be on the floor of the House of Representatives when he delivered it. To the right, his right, on the floor. He was to my left at the podium. I was looking into the faces of a packed House of Representatives change. I was as close as I was to some of you. All the members of Congress were there, except the delegation, the entire delegation from Alabama. They boycotted the speech. Every one of the Supreme Court justices were there. In the galleries, diplomats, Lady Bird and Lyndon Johnson, people, black and white, some of them in business suits, some of them in street clothes. The president was at the podium, and I had a clear line to his profile. I was just 15 feet from him, as close as Maria is over there to us here, and I could look at his profile as he spoke. Now, Lyndon Johnson was capable of many moods. He was 16 of the most complex people I've ever known. And he could be crude, and he could be magnanimous, and he was the best dancer in the White House since George Washington, but he was also one of the most bumbling men I knew. He was many personas, but this night, something happened. And in what one historian called a slow, melodious voice. He was said to have had no rhetorical skills. And they said they contrasted him to Kennedy, who was elegant and eloquent and youthful and fulsome on television. But not Lyndon Johnson, but as he began in a slow, melodious tone. And this is what has changed, Michael. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. At times, history and fate meet in a single place to shape a turning point in our unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. Now think for a moment what he just did. He linked this tiny little town of 30,000 people in Dallas County, Alabama, with the great myths of America, the mythological narrative of who we would like to be as a people. And he compared it to Appomattox and the historic, decisive victory over slavery for the Union, and to Concord and Lexington. What connection did they have to each other? They now have one he made that night. I'm telling you, when he said that, so it was last week in Selma, Alabama, that silence in the chamber was imprisoning. We all felt as if we were in the same trip together. There were no coughs, no shuffling. There was nothing. Silence. And all of a sudden you understood the metaphysical reality that can happen when people are together and joined by a moral idea, taken out of their parochial places and given something in common to believe in. And then suddenly he picked it up. The nation, he said, has reached a moral juncture brought there by the cries of pain and the hymns of protest of oppressed people who have summoned into convocation all the majesty of this great government. Rarely, listen to this line, rarely in one time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, should we double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue, then we will have failed as a nation and as a people. For with a country, as with a person, what is man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Then there was a clap. The first clap was a sound burst. Then there were split seconds of stillness in that chamber. Randall Wood's I think his one volume of Johnson's life is the best single volume. He wrote, no president, not even Abraham Lincoln, had so forthrightly identified himself, the Constitution, and the values of the country with the equal rights for African Americans. By now, his voice was inspired, rolling, ringing, what a historian called a Texas version of the Southern Baptist rhythm and tenor that Martin Luther King had so mastered. And then he said this, there is no constitutional issue here. The command of the Constitution is plain. There is no moral issue here. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. There is no issue of states' rights or national rights. There is only the struggle for human rights. And then the president said this, their cause must be our cause. because it is not Negroes, really, but it is all of us who must overcome its crippling legacy of bigotry and justice. And then the President of the United States lifted his hands above his head, you caught this, and said, "We shall overcome." God in his heaven could not have said amen more powerfully than the throng in that chamber did with a roaring and prolonged ovation. And I could see people overwhelmed right there in the chamber, their eyes filling with tears. And up in the galleries, you could see the old veterans of the Civil War movement hugging each other, crying uncontrollably. It was, as Lady Bird said later, like that old hymn, "Once to every man and nation comes a moment to decide." And the real change, Michael, since then and there, is no one will speak like that and touch us all in our common, what Lincoln said, the mystic chord of memory. That's the big change. It was that speech that I felt privileged to listen to.
So, folks have questions, and thank you so much. We have a microphone over here and time for a few questions. So folks should line up.
So Myrna, as you mentioned, so much of our resources have recently gone on the defensive. I'm wondering what you and what Kristen, you are working on the advocacy front to promote and what we can do to improve our democracy and expand voting rights.
Thank you. I think it's really important to make sure that the American public has something to be for, not just to be against something. We need to get some wins and to have some ideas that we are excited about and are trying to move forward, because otherwise I think we're not going to be in a position where any advancements are made. We're just preventing retrenchment. So there are a couple of things that the Brennan Center is focusing on right now. One is something called automatic voter registration, which the Brennan Center conceived and designed of about 10 years ago. It is something pretty simple. It's the idea of changing the way you register to vote such that it is presumed that you want to register to vote and that it is presumed that you want to be part of the democratic process. And so the question is asked to you, we're going to register you to vote unless you tell us you don't want to be. The folks that are behavioral scientists in the room or familiar with healthcare will call that a change from an opt-in system to an opt-out system. And that's supposed to have a really big effect on how people think about registering and voting. We're also going to try and work very, very hard to make sure that a number of the 4.5 million people who are living and working in our communities who cannot vote because of a criminal conviction in their past are able to participate in our democracy. There's a really important initiative happening in Florida to try and restore voting rights to most of the 1.4 million people who cannot vote because of a criminal conviction in the past. The Brennan Center was some of the primary drafters behind that amendment. We're hoping that we're going to get a number of the signatures that we need in order to be able to be successful then. There's also efforts trying to happen just across the river in New Jersey, where we're trying to get folks there who are disenfranchised to also be able to participate. So I think those two issues, automatic voter registration and rights restoration, are the progressive campaigns to watch in the next few years, and I hope that we will have all of your support as we're trying to get these reforms happening across the country.
Kristen.
So I think what's happening around the country is really remarkable. For the first time in modern time, people are really paying attention to elections at the local, at the state, and the federal level. And I think people get it, that elections do matter, that they do shape our lives. And I'm excited about the Women's March and a lot of the mass mobilization efforts that we're seeing that are working to activate young voters and women and college students to ensure that we've got some new voices participating in our democracy this cycle. But equally important is that we provide protection for those people, for new and existing voters, because voter suppression, sadly, is a part of our political reality in this country. And one of the things that we lead at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is the Election Protection Program. It's the nation's largest and oldest nonpartisan voter protection program, started in 2001 after Bush v. Gore. It includes a partnership with hundreds of local and state organizations and law firms that stretch from coast to coast. It is anchored by an 866-hour vote hotline, and this remarkable nationwide effort is staffed by volunteers, trained legal volunteers who take calls and complaints from voters and help them troubleshoot and overcome the barriers that sometimes stand between them and the ballot box. And we actually just launched our effort today. The 2018 election cycle has commenced. There were elections today in Texas that are wrapping up probably in about an hour. And we've got elections coming up in Illinois. It's important that we pay attention and fight back against the voter suppression that we see. And then one last thing, litigation. You talked about media, Michael, and how important the media is in our democracy right now. And you know, civil rights lawyers, I think, are critically important right now. That victory that we talked about with the Election Integrity Commission being dismantled, I mean, President Trump signed an executive order disbanding his own commission. And that was a remarkable outcome that was the result of one thing, not just the voice in opposition of the people, but the power of civil rights lawyers that backed this administration into a corner. And in the courtrooms, we are showing this administration that they're not above the law, and where they can't demonstrate that their actions and efforts comply with the law, we are winning. And it's important, I think, for the public to recognize how critically important the courts are in the work of civil rights lawyers, and I encourage you to support the work of the Brennan Center, support the work of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. It's a really important part of pushing back against a lot of the bad things we face today.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, my question is about the Florida referendum, which, if folks don't know, has qualified for the ballot. Florida activists had to gather over 1 million signatures to make that happen. Very onerous process, which I can tell folks about afterwards if they want the gory details. I'll just mention briefly, I work with a New York committee that's trying to offer ways for New Yorkers to help the campaign for a yes vote. I've got flyers. I'll be in the lobby after if people want to see me about that. My question is more political than legal, but it's about the coming campaign in Florida in advance of November and how that's going to reverberate throughout the nation. In Virginia, folks may have seen Ed Gillespie, former chair of the RNC, tried to generate a lot of fear among Virginia voters around this issue of voting rights for folks with felony conviction, and it was a big flop. He lost not just narrowly, but by 9%. Rick Scott has had some bad publicity around his essentially fake executive clemency conviction that's the fig leaf on what is essentially a lifetime ban on voting rights for folks with a felony conviction in that state. So right now, the campaign against this referendum is not real robust, but it requires 60% to pass. And I would assume that the Koch brothers and the Mercers and forces like that are going to dump a whole bunch of money in Florida late in the game, tell a lot of lies, and try and turn that around. Right now, it's polling pretty well. I want to get any say you guys might offer on what to expect in that debate in public, how that might resonate beyond Florida, and if this passes, what that would mean for states like New Jersey or New York that also disenfranchise people, even if not such an extreme way, for felony convictions.
I'm wondering if I can broaden the question out just a little bit to how democracy itself plays out as an issue in elections in America today. And do we have a chance to make this fight over the way we run our self-governing democracy a voting issue? Do you all think that that is a possibility?
Well, people generally don't turn out for abstractions like democracy. They turn out, and Johnson knew this so well, for what affects them directly and immediately. And so it does help for Kennedy and Johnson and others to make speeches about the quality of our politics and government, but what's really going to decide, every election become very local now with different issues like the referendum down there, and my hunch is that referendum will be decided in the last week to 10 days, because that's when apparently, as the gentleman said, the Mercers and the Kochs who promised to put $400 million into their side of the fight this year will pour most of their fake commercials, their misleading commercials, and it'll be people who wake up at the last minute who are affected pro or con for that by what they see on these commercials. I think that's those appeals to fear and those appeals to prejudice against felons and all of that. And then the other side will have to say what this means to the state. Florida is a state that will be engulfed in the arms race, the NRA, at that time, and somebody's going to have to decide how, without debasing what happened in Parkland, to turn that into something that people then do see as a matter of a safe society. Oh, yeah, that's not yours.
My question is, as someone who worked in the White House, quite closely to the president, how do you think the modern White House, under any administration, has changed in the way that it interacts with social movements? I imagine White Houses today are much busier than they were. Staffs are larger. So how does that change, if anything, affect?
Well, Michael should answer that because, look, I've come from the remote past, the 1960s. He served as a Clinton speechwriter in the 1990s, and neither you nor I, certainly not I, and probably you, had limited understanding of social media at that time. Today, I understand. I don't have any firsthand knowledge that it is governed by tweet largely and instant messaging, and that creates every day, every hour, a different crisis or a different threat or a different opportunity. I don't know how you keep up in the White House. We only had 12 special assistants to the president and a National Security Council staff of about 24. Today, hundreds of assistants, hundreds of the National Security staff. It costs $1 billion a year just to support the White House today. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson helped pass the Civil Rights Act of '65 by getting rid of the Kennedy tax bill that came before him, was on the list that Kennedy left before civil rights. He got rid of that by agreeing to a budget, a federal budget of less than $1 billion, and therefore winning the chairman of the House, the Senate Appropriations Committee. I have no idea how they keep up today.
Well, and I should say that to the folks I work with at the Brennan Center, my service in the White House in the 1990s is like telling them I worked in the Van Buren administration and how interesting that was. It was so different. I will say that the institutionalization of the presidency had grown quite a bit by that point, and there was so much noise, the beginnings of the 24-hour news cycle, not social media really, but cable news and talk radio, that it almost became background noise. It became actually quite easy to ignore. It's one of the reasons people read polls so much, because they didn't have the other ways of taking soundings of public opinion. And it was also at that moment when I was there a very demobilized time, certainly among progressives, although among the rising forces of the right, it was a time of great mobilization, which we saw with the Newt Gingrich contract with America generation takeover of Congress, and then continuing. What I think is challenging, and I don't know that we necessarily know the answer, is that White Houses now, when I was there, the executive office of the president had, I believe, about 1,000 people working there. It now has 2,000 people. Wow. This is the product, among other things, of the war on terror and the response to 9/11. But it grew during President Obama's 2 terms. And one of the reasons that people don't seem so bothered by the fact that all these positions go unfilled in the rest of the executive branch is they kind of think they don't really need them. Policy toward Korea is run by somebody in the National Security Council, and so on and so on. They have the White House counsel's office has grown enormously in size and power, and so the Justice Department is less important. I think that the great challenge for the issues of today is how to break through the armor and to become not background noise, but an urgent voice. And it's not entirely clear how that happens in the social media era. But when it happens, it will be very powerful, I think. Yes, we have time for 2 more questions, I think.
Yes, sir. My name is Christopher Viccio. I'm with the Southern Poverty Law Center Voting Rights Project. And I also was involved with Attorney Daniel Sheehan with the Iran-Contra affair. And for many who don't know, I feel it's an honor to be in the presence of you, Mr. Moyers, because you did help expose many of the people at Iran-Contra with constitutional crisis. My question to you, Mr. Moyers, is our Constitution in crisis right now with the Trump administration?
Well, I want to get the 2 lawyers over here to answer that, because something Christine said. No, I do think the rule of law is threatened. I was glad to hear you say what lawyers are doing to fight back. But on many fronts, other than civil rights, they seem to be bending the law, perhaps irreparably. I don't know. You 2 can answer that better than I can. All of the institutions, media under assault, changing dramatically, fake news, all of that. But I'm not a constitutional scholar or student, and I'd love to hear what you all think about that.
I do think we are on the verge of a constitutional crisis in our country. I talked about how critical lawyers are, but the reality is we have a president who inherited a historic number of vacancies on our federal courts. The courts, I think, are a really critical part of our democratic infrastructure. And what President Trump is doing is nominating a slate of virtually all white, all male, radical, far outside the mainstream nominees to fill these lifetime appointments to our nation's courts. And so for those of us who believe in the rule of law, I'm deeply concerned about President Trump's ability to transform our courts for a generation to come with people who don't understand or appreciate the rule of law, who are not capable of fairly and independently handling the cases and controversies that come before it. And we have a Senate that sadly is turning its back on many of the longstanding rules and traditions that have guided how the Senate has evaluated nominees that have come before it. Abandonment of the blue slip tradition, among other things. So when I think about what's happening with the courts, it causes me grave concern. There's no turning back. These are lifetime appointments once confirmed, and the kinds of people that President Trump has put forward are people who never should see the light of day. If people saw Peterson, whose hearing went viral, this is somebody who knows nothing about the rules of evidence, has not done any trial work, and he almost got a seat on the DC federal court, one of our most important federal courts. He was smoked out, but there's so many people who haven't. We're talking about nominees who have blogged their support for the KKK, nominees who have openly talked about transgender children being Satan's children, people who have no business serving on our federal court. So for that reason, I do think we are on the verge of a crisis.
And I would say, first of all, if folks are interested in rule of law issues, they should check out some of the coming discussions where we are going to be hosting events like today where we're focused specifically on the issue of rule of law. In addition to our Constitution having challenges, I think our democracy is really under attack right now. I think we're seeing an assault in various forms. One of them is just the tarnishing of our democratic institutions, saying things that are patently untrue, like there are millions of non-citizens voting, does 2 things. One, it invokes like the worst of the racist fears that we have in this country toward especially Latinos, but immigrants from a bunch of other places. And 2, it undermines a faith in the electoral outcomes. When we have things like our country not being free from like Russian cyber criminals, and the country not doing enough to deal with that, that also undermines faith in our democratic systems. When we're not resourcing election administrators so that they can, have enough voting machines that are running well, that they make sure that their poll workers are being trained, those things undermine our democracy. And finally, when you get people so disgusted with politicians who seem to be willing to say anything, or do anything to get elected, willing to take money from just about anybody, and willing to go on media saying things that aren't true. You have people that are just checking out and are not interested in participating. So that makes it very hard for someone like me, who's in the business of trying to get people engaged in participating, to think that it's even worth it, right? Because the system is so bankrupt, they don't have any faith in it. And so I would urge all of you, notwithstanding the very real challenges we have, don't lose heart. Keep voting and participating. Keep encouraging your other people, the friends you know, your neighbors, your church members, to vote and participate, because otherwise the bad guys win. And I don't want to give my country to them.
I would say this, Michael. What seem like small infringements that go unchallenged or unchecked can become precedents that grow into mountains in our path. I mean, the Constitution somewhere speaks against nepotism. And no, that will bring laughter like that. But nepotism, we're seeing it play out now in ways in which the interest of the government and the Trump family have become solidified. And if that goes unpunished, not unpunished, if that goes unchallenged and unchecked, we'll see that precedent become an ongoing reality. And John Adams, I agree with what you said. John Adams said, there's never been a democracy that didn't commit suicide. And he said the average life of a democracy is 250 years. So subtract 2018 from 1787, and you will see the time frame in which to hear what he said. And I've always felt, in part because of our own blunders, that a democracy can die of too many lies. And as you said, we're suffocating in them now.
One last question from Tony Butler, and we will answer quickly.
So let me just say, when I work with Michael and Myrna and collaborate with Kristen's colleagues at the Brennan Center, but I want to first acknowledge Mr. Moyers, what an honor it is, and what kind of nourishment and elevation and enlightenment you have provided me in my lifetime. And I want to thank you for your service to the public. The witness to history that you've demonstrated tonight, though, I recently took a moment to share with some of the young people at the Brennan Center the documentary on Freedom Summer, the Mississippi Project in 1964, which is a part of a somewhat, in my view, unheralded view of the movement, the grassroots movement that helped to propel the country in that era. And there's a theory about the big man of history, the rhetoric, and the great people, the Kings and the Johnsons, but what about the people who were on the ground, the Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerners, who were the spearhead, who gave their lives trying to register people to vote in Mississippi, and what happened in that summer of 1964? What did you see and experience in the White House? How did that grassroots movement resonate with what Johnson was contending with and what you experienced?
I am so
time?
glad you asked that question because I failed to say the most important thing, which is Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Congress passed it, but they wouldn't have done so if it hadn't been for all the volunteers, all the martyrs, all the activists out there. One of my chief jobs in the first half of '64 was liaison with civic groups, religious groups, and other groups around the country. And I would spend an hour or two every day with religious activists from the different denominations and the different faiths. And there came a point in the passage of the Civil Rights Act when every member of Congress who went home for a recess would be met by a cluster of pastors and ministers from his or her community who would say, "How are you going to vote on civil rights?" And we did that. And the activists in the South, I've been doing research late. I'll never get to it because I'm 84 years old, but I'll never get to it. I want to do a documentary about the 40s in the South, which were a period of beginning to be mobilized and terrific slaughter and destruction and pain. The last sequence in Mudbound is such a familiar scene to those of us who grew up in the South. The flaying of a young African black man who woke up and spoke out and acted. That was common in the 40s and the early 50s. And while we've had stories of the heroes, Rosa Parks and Martin and all of those people in our consciousness, we don't know the names. Brian Stevens has done a wonderful thing in Montgomery with his new museum on this sort of it's the history of lynching, really. And that needs to be told, because they were lynched not because they stood for nothing, but because they stood for change and courage and challenge. And these two acts that I was privileged to be a minor part of would never, ever have happened if it had not been for volunteer citizens taking it under their own destiny to work for change.
Yes, thank you. And what a powerful note on which to end. Thank you so much to Bill Moyers, to Kristen Clarke, to Myrna Pérez, and to all of you for being part of this conversation. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
That was great.